Hi, guys. Welcome to the Lit Mag Lab podcast. This is Vevna Forrow. Yeah, let's get started. All right, guys. So previously, I was essentially doing a rundown of my experience running Dippity Lit Mag and Dippity Press. Dippity Lit Mag has been around since 2022. Dippity Press came, about 2 years after. So it was literally, almost a 2 hour long episode. Obviously, I didn't do it all in one day, as you may have noticed in that description. But still, it was a lot to cover, so I just wanted to share as much as possible. And yeah, I hope you got something out of that episode. If you listen back, if you haven't yet, totally look at it. It's more so, I think, for those looking to start a lit mag or journal or, potential founding editors, that particular episode. But yeah, I think I want to circle back, to, the submitter side, for this Q&A episode. So, and yeah, if you're a submitter or wondering what things are like behind the scenes or things, editors go through, maybe that episode helped you or gave you insight into it too, or maybe you're thinking about starting your own lit manga journal. Anyways, again, so this episode, I'm going to circle back to, submitters, right? A submitter Q&A. So I guess you could word it as, how do I get a short story acceptance, right? I keep getting rejections all the time with my short stories, and it can't seem to land anywhere or find a home for my shorts. So, yeah, I think, on this podcast, I've covered predominantly poetry, poems, right, in that realm. And generally, I shared, in an episode, right, how do I get a acceptance with a lit mag or journal? And my voice may be breaking again, so I apologize. But, yeah. So short stories, right? They are short, right? Obviously, right? It's in the name. So they're not easy to create, right? You have a small window, you could say, to, create an impact, upon the reader, or in this case, right, the editorial team or the editor, right? Whoever's doing the reading on the team, right? And I think you could look at it this way, right? Let's say you have, a story, right? Let's say there's a call, right, with no cap on the word limit, no cap on anything, right? They just say submit a story, right? There's no word count, no page count limit or anything like that, right? You essentially are presenting them with a whole pie, or they're giving the opportunity to present a whole pie, right? Because there's no restrictions or limits on, anything like that in the guidelines, but with flash fiction, with the short story, on the other hand, they typically, right, have word count limits, page count limits, and, and you essentially can only present, right, in that case, a small slice, right, just one slice of the pie, right? You don't have that same breathing room, or, so, I was thinking back, I was trying to come up with an analogy for you guys, but I was thinking back to, like, the Great British Baking Show. My mom and I used to watch that, and, several other baking shows, Cake Wars and Cupcake Wars, and, a lot of the Food Network competitions are fun. I just love seeing, like, the final designs of those, and it was really cool. Even some of the, chocolate making episodes, and, yeah, I really enjoyed those cake design episodes and stuff. It was always, like, I always wanted to, like, do a cake design myself for fun or something, but I haven't gotten around to doing that. I mean, I made, like, chocolate chip walnut bread and stuff. But anyways, so yeah, pie's awesome, by the way. So I was trying to give an analogy, you don't have that same, breathing room, I'd say, with that, when you have that restriction there, you really have to think about making a impact, bite-sized impact right away right out of the gate. And, yeah, it's hard. I personally, guys, PS, I love, chocolate tofu pie. I just really loved, like, organic chocolate tofu pie. Like, the Wedge Co-op had, like, the best chocolate tofu pie. My dad, by the way, also, growing up, he made, like, some really good bean pie. And my mom made some really great pumpkin pie over the years. So those were, like, my faves for sure. And, yeah, just sharing. I don't know what you guys' fave pies are, but, yeah. I think I was a huge fan of also that iCarly pie episode. Look it up. It was really comical and humorous, right? They were trying to get the pie recipe. I never forgot that episode. It always made me laugh too. Yeah. So anyways, so enough about pie, but you get what I'm saying, right? You really have to think about that, the starting point of your short story, right? There's that saying, right? The hook, line, and sinker. You want to really grab the attention of the reader from the get-go. You want to pull them in and reel them in, like when you go fishing, right? Reeling in a fish, right? Same thing, right? You want something to really spark that short story right off the bat. So, the starting point, should draw us in. The middle, you could say it's like the box or bow tie forming, and then the end is, wrapping it all up, right? Tying it together, obviously. You want to make sure it's, cohesive and clear, right? The title itself, right, shouldn't be something random and irrelevant too. That's also important, just because your short story may be, great, but the title also is like a starting point as well, not just the first line. You wouldn't, necessarily get a story titled, The Fast Cat about a dog, or mismatched titles, right? Same applies to a poem. Some titles throw us off, right? When we're reading a piece or even, other types of writing and forms. So, yeah. So, yeah, like The Adventures of Mr. Muffins, the cat. I don't know if there's a cat out there called Mr. Muffins. In any case, that's a cute name. But, it shouldn't be about a dog, right? The story shouldn't be all about a dog if that's the title, right? That would be just kind of really bizarre. So, I've seen things like that, where a title is completely different from what the content of the write is. So you have to really pay attention to that. But, yeah. I think mostly, I'll share some things like our reading team, typically says like common things we see, right, through our short story windows and flash fiction. So at Dippity Lit Mag, for example, and, we have flash fiction calls. We've started to have those windows again, right, for flash fiction within 500 words. And then we also separated out, short stories, right? Over the years, Dippity Lit Mag has short stories, fiction, right? Within 2.5 pages, right? A cap there. And yeah, so you could say we're on the much shorter side, right? Some places, in the Lit Mag world or space, right? They have, different word counts and different page length guidelines. So you have to pay mind to that. You don't want to ever send more than the allotted amount of short stories, If you do end up doing that, what I've seen personally, and I have submitted my own short stories to some places just to see, what it's like myself, right? I've typically, do poetry, right, writing and stuff like that. But I ended up, accidentally missing that this place only allowed I think 2 short stories at a time or something. I ended up sending 3. They said we'll only consider the first 2 that you sent as to read. I think that's what it said. Or the first, they had a set number and I went over it, so they only read the first 2, I think, yeah. And some places will outright decline you if you go over the word count or, even like with poems, right, the line length, right, and things like that. But short stories, right, don't go over the word count. Don't send more than the allotted, right? That's just a easy way you'll get a decline, right, off the bat, not following the guidelines. And some places, right, again, let's say they're horror themed, right, or focus on Halloween writing or, motherhood, and you're sending something completely irrelevant to the theme or focus or vibe of the Lit Mag Journal, right? That's going to get an obvious decline, right? A place that focuses on humor writing, as I mentioned, right? A Lit Mag Journal, right? They don't want to read sad, depressing, Humpty Dumpty stories, right? So just keep that in mind. You want to make sure, that you do that appropriately. Now at Dippity Lit Mag, we don't have, themed short story calls currently at the present time. That could change. I don't know. But yeah, so mostly it's just you have to focus on, the word count and the our page length, depending which category you're submitting to, flash fiction or the short story bucket we have. And, we really look for creativity, right? Obviously, right? We want to see something creative, right? And, things that don't rush the end, the beginning, or the middle, right? Things that don't feel rushed. I think oftentimes, you have to ask yourself, I see this comment from our reading team oftentimes, in their notes, right? I read everyone on our reading teams, all submissions notes. So, a thing, that comes into our mind, right? What's the purpose of this short story? Or, what's the message trying to get across? Why, think about it this way, something that on my reading team that others have mentioned, why would anyone want to read this, right? What's the purpose of it? What are you trying to get across? our writing, right, a reason behind it, right, a driving point, right? We want to see that build up in your short story. We want to see it, like a home run. So, a short story, again, may have a great focus too, and things like that. But, if your word choices are flat, the story will be flat too, right? It can be very bland. We don't want to see bland language. We don't want to see, plain word choices, lacking descriptiveness, just because, you have a short amount of words to work with, right? Doesn't mean, that means you have to resort to very short sentences that are very, just like, very too clear cut and abrupt, summarizing things rather than, you're summarizing things rather than showing things, right? There's that whole aspect of show versus telling, right? So like saying, oh, towards the end, I've seen in short stories, like she fell in love, she graduated, she was 50 years old, right? Just like very short sentences like that. Or he dove in the pool and swam to the other side, right? Things like that. That's not really, or they ate all the pie, right? What was the pie? What was the pie? Where were they swimming to from originally? What was point A to point B? There's question marks there, and like, saying someone fell in love, right? What was like the moment they fell in love? Maybe focus and zero in on that scene, right? And build that specific scene out, right? Don't hop around from moment to moment to moment to moment, right? That skipping and hopping around can be confusing. It can make it feel rushed. And yeah, so I'd say really focus on building up a specific scene, pack it with as much detail possible. Don't, it's easy to be overly wordy, too. I've had that in the past where I've been that way, and maybe still am a little bit. But, you have to really think about, you can write it out, your short story or flash fiction piece, and then comb through it, refine it, edit it, grammatical errors, as we've seen submissions, in the short story realm, right, that are riddled with grammatical errors, road bumps, unnecessary italics, and that just is disruptive to the reader, right? So you want to make sure you take the time to read it over. I know, like, if you're submitting it to the last end of the window or the cutoff point, right, you may be rushing things to get it in, but just take that, additional minute or two, or just a couple minutes to read it at least once or twice before sending it off officially. So yeah. What else, guys? So, I would say, it's totally okay, right, to do, classic spin-offs, right, of like existing characters in the world. Like, we've totally had things come through our door, right, Romeo and Juliet, but it has to have like a fresh twist or spin on it, right, a fresh perspective. You don't want to just, ask yourself this: are you just recreating or replicating a story that already exists in the world? That, are you just reiterating it in your words all over again, scene for scene, event for event, or moment for moment that happened? That's not original at all, really. I've seen others just retell even news stories, based on real events, and you have to pay attention. Are you saying something that's essentially happened before, that's been said and done, So don't go, obvious routes with your work. I think that is just that's not surprising. That's not going to wow anyone, right? And think again, are you following a call? Is it fiction, or is it is it flash fiction? Is it nonfiction? What are they asking for? You have to make sure, if they're asking for fiction, that you're presenting fiction, right? Just keep that in mind. So yeah, I think something else, to take in consideration, right? Are you using past and present tense incorrectly? On the past podcast episode, I may have, towards the end, totally in my word choices there. I don't know if you caught that, but anyways, and then, think about, third person, first person, second person, the perspective you're telling it from, think about what would be the most powerful perspective to tell that particular story or event, you're focusing on from, that in that manner. So don't ever be too abrupt, right? I feel like it's okay, no doubt, it's okay to have cliffhangers or things leaving us sitting on the edge of our seat to our story, but it should feel conclusive, right? It should feel conclusive. And, I like short stories that make us want to, the moment we start reading it, right, they make you want to read the next line, the next line, the next line, what happens next. But, towards the end, if it's not all like, wrapped up in a bow tie, like really nicely, right, you're going to feel let down, right, and disappointed. Like, I think a lot of cases with short stories, you're like, you're like, I wish this was way longer, sometimes if it's a really good story, and, you don't have that same, again, breathing room, like with 500 words or, whatever page limit it is, right? So I think in some cases, depending upon what you're focusing on, in your short story or story in general, right? Some things are not really appropriate to be just flash fiction or, just a couple pages or 500 words. Some things really need that breathing room to build out, right? So, if you're looking for places that have longer, word counts or page limits or, page lengths, right, you should look at those places, right? If you're the type of writer that likes having more room to write, or you're, not everyone, has a strength with flash fiction per se, or you can totally strengthen your flash fiction skills and stuff by writing and getting feedback from others maybe, and, even from close friends or, their feedback call windows, as I mentioned on this podcast, some free, some not, but, some writers do better when it's not, flash fiction, and they just do better when it's a straight up, fiction call, and they can write as many pages as they like, or maybe 5 pages or 6 pages, right? Or, several thousand words in the word count, right, limit. So just keep that in mind, if you see yourself not really, or struggling with flash fiction, you may want to try other calls that are a bit longer in length and see, but I think, you totally, again, can strengthen your flash fiction skills and your, doing short word count challenges. Totally. It just takes time, I would say I have seen, others in community mention they've gotten thousands upon thousands of rejections, short stories wise, hundreds, even several hundreds or over 1,000 or 2,000, and only a couple short stories ever landed in some lit magazine journals. So you really have to keep trying. And, over time, I know some writers have gotten, about boatloads, right? I mentioned on this podcast, like they've been published in, 50, 60 places, but it took, think about how many rejections it took to get to that number of 60 or 50, right, acceptances. It takes time. So don't feel like, I've had, like 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 rejections, and it's going nowhere. You have to keep trying. And you may want to, again, get feedback, do detailed feedback options, from reputable places, right? Look at, places that, have been around a bit. And, there's now like a recommendation feature on Chill Subs and stuff, and some places where you'll find, comments or thoughts on lit magazine journals too. But yeah, I think for some, feedback workshop events, attending those, there are some events, as I've shared on the, event episode, or some of the episodes I mentioned events and writing workshops that you can look into if you dig through this podcast. But those can help you totally become a better writer. The Loft Literary Center, they have virtual workshops too, back in my home state, and they have virtual and on-site. So, tons of workshops and writing events, even locally you could start, and you don't necessarily have to attend on site. You can if you want to, So, yeah. I would say also something that I have seen, some writers, I think, assume, that once you get an acceptance with a place, right, a lit mag or journal, they'll always accept your work, and that's not necessarily true. That's not the case, right? Your work, at Dippity Lit Mag, for example, it goes through rounds of review, right? We have, you can consider it again like a voting block. Like, think about it like I mentioned, the CBS Survivor. One of those shows where they have a voting block, right? On your work, and it goes through scoring, right? And we put our thoughts and internally on it, and based on that, if it follows the guidelines, right, it typically moves on, and then we score it right in each round. So even if you direct it, choose a fast track option, right, that doesn't necessarily mean the editor's always going to accept your work. It really comes down to the quality of the piece, if we felt it was strong enough, So, I think, some places, right, lit magazine journals, they make others as like regular contributors, or to the publication, and in that case, right, they may work with you, right, to iron out a piece or to make sure it's ready, or work with you, further a little bit more if you become a regular contributor of a publication. But yeah, just keep that in mind. Just because a place accepted your work in the past doesn't mean they'll always take your work, right? It really depends the quality, the word choices, the descriptiveness. Are you surprising us, right? Is it something we've seen before? Is it just another, ordinary story, right? Like, I've seen some short stories and things, come my way that were like, almost akin to, very uneventful. Like, I walked the dog, we played at the park, and we went home, and I hugged him. That's very uneventful. That's a very common, thing to do. There's nothing very unique about that, right? Or, I was at home with my cat, and a typical day, they're just like outlining it. It's nothing really impactful, right? There's nothing moving us emotionally or driving us to really want to continue on and continue on. It's just another ordinary day, with some, could have some bits of humor in it, but it's not really unique or distinct, right? So really stay away from bland language and ordinary word choices, right? You want to paint a picture, right, in that short window that you have to capture our attention, right? And the introduction is so important, totally. I think also, I've seen cases where writers, they overwhelm their piece with dialogue. Like, there's no balance between, descriptiveness or the scene that's taking place and the dialogue, right? It's just nothing but back to back to back dialogue, or it's very heavy dialogue-wise or confusing dialogue-wise too. So if you have multiple characters, involved, right, you want to make sure there's balance there. And yeah, so I would say time and time again, I feel like I've seen writers, again, rush the ending. So it should feel like a build-up, right? Totally. I'll share, guys. So, I may have mentioned this on a podcast before, or an episode briefly, but I had this flash fiction story, and I may start sharing some of my old high school work out there just for fun, by the way. I've pushed some out, right, as ebooks and other places just for fun, and I don't really care if others rate my high school work and give it 1 star, 2 star. It's just fun to share, what my high school writing was like back in the day, or middle school writing too, and all the short stories I wrote. I have a bunch from way back. And yeah, so just an example, one of my flash fiction stories was about, again, a solar flare or some incoming thing, and these 2 astronauts have a mission to save Earth, essentially, and they have to get this panel up, and something goes wrong, right? And he tries to, he wants to save his friend, right, on the mission, and they're running out of time, right? There's a countdown happening, right? They can hear it, right? 10, 9, 8, 7, right? It's counting down, and they're running out of time to put the panel up to block or redirect it, right, from hitting the planet, right, and Earth, right? And yeah, so it's sort of a cliffhanger type flash fiction story, and it just like impending doom, you could say, and yeah, I had some like that. I've also written some short stories, not flash fiction, but that were, like, example, there was this pickpocketer, right? His name was Pierre Drew Chiron, and I totally may dig this up and publish it out there, because I really loved that short story I wrote back in the day in high school. I don't know, I thought it was really fun. So it's he had like a Robin Hood type character, right? He would, after an interaction with kids in need of money, right? And he gave away, some of the pickpocketed money and wallets and stuff. He would essentially, I don't condone stealing, of course, or anything like that, but, he would take from the rich, give to the poor, right? Obviously, that's like the Robin Hood type character he was. And ever since then, after that one moment between, the kids in need of, money and help, right? He, ended up, giving away money that he would pickpocket and stuff, and wallets from, the corrupt and greedy people, right, in the place, right? So, yeah, and for some short stories, I totally had to research, words in other languages and stuff like that. I like doing that, and looking up places that exist in real life, in different countries, and, the types of building and architecture that exist there to build out the scene more, and stuff like that. And yeah, for some of the short stories from time to time, right, it's I recall I would, and I have to reread some of the old ones I did from high school and middle school now. I feel like just going back there. It's been a while since I've reread them. But, what are they wearing? Where are they exactly, and just painting that out a bit. With flash fiction, again, you don't really have that same, again, breathing room, as I mentioned, to really work with. So you want a bite-size, pie slice, right? That's a beautiful, right? And, yeah. So I'm sorry, guys. I know I said I wasn't going to mention food on other episodes, but food and allergies, and I'm mentioning food. Sorry, I apologize. I know it's something. I have to get pie now, guys. Maybe I just want pie really badly. I don't know what it is. But, yeah, pie memories, guys. Pie, I guess. It's not even Thanksgiving. Oh, yeah, well, it's not Thanksgiving quite yet or anything like that. But I guess we're getting closer to, like October and Halloween, too, and stuff. So maybe I'm thinking about that and stuff. Anyways, like pumpkin pie and stuff. So anyways, if you guys write any pumpkin pie short stories, let me know. I'm just joking. But, yeah. So, yeah, flash fiction is not easy by any means. I think, again, what really helped me, sharing my short stories or feeling comfortable doing that was, again, partaking in online writing communities. I mentioned this on the podcast quite a bit. There are tons out there. There's some new ones I've come across, too, recently. I can't remember the names off the top of my head, but tons of online writing communities exist, right, to share short stories, and your work out there. Just keep in mind, a lot of places don't accept previously published work, At Dippy Lit Mag, we do permit just for short stories, right, previously published there. And then through some of our feature channels, right, like our Substack, we do allow, like, if it's been on social media, prior. But, yeah, for our issues, in terms of poetry and stuff, that has to be previously unpublished, never before seen. So just keep that in mind. Every place has different guidelines on, whether they permit previously published short stories. You just have to tell them, typically where it's appeared before and be honest about that. But yeah, so yeah, I'm probably going to dive back in and look through some of my old short stories and maybe share more of those out there, my old ones from my archives and stuff. But I do have some out there, I guess. One of my favorite short stories I really worked quite a bit on, I think, was like When the Time Goes. It's still out there as an ebook, and it was a time traveler type of story, short story. And I just really, really loved that one that I created. It was inspired by, that film, The Time Machine. I don't know how many of you guys, I mentioned that movie, I think, on this podcast, but I've always really loved time machine or, time travel, teleportation movies and stuff like that. It's always been something I just really, loved. I don't know what it is about that, but I think, going back into the past, I'm sure you've all seen Back to the Future and stuff like that, right? But, I think my favorite all-time time traveler movie was definitely, that one with Alexander Hardigan. And yeah, it was, I think that was a 2002 movie, right? I think it was. And I also really love Timeline 2003. Yeah, I think that one was with Paul Walker, Timeline 2003. And yeah, and 2002, the Time Machine, that was definitely my all-time favorite time traveling movie. Yeah, I think we all wish we could go back in the past and change a moment of our life maybe, or something, do differently. I think especially when, it comes to, things in our life taking an unexpected turn or something, or, yeah, and things like that. But, yeah, we can only move forwards, right, in life, I guess. So, but I think oftentimes we think about what ifs, or what if I met this person earlier? Or what if I, didn't move here? What if I took that job instead? There are things I think about like that, parallel universes even, that whole aspect. It's interesting how, we hear about other planets existing or other, further out in space. And we're like, I wonder whether there's another planet out there, besides, with life like ours, right? Exactly, right? Way, way out there in space, right? Further out that we're unaware of. I think the universe is very mysterious, right? And very cool. So, I like writing about, things that are, science fiction, in a sense, or, things that, you could say are very, far out, I guess. I don't know. Yeah, so yeah, yeah, I've always been a fan of time traveler movies and stuff like that. But there was a song, I was listening, I think, by Caitlin Tanver or Tarver. I can't remember if it was Caitlin or not. Yeah, I think Parallel Universe was a song I was listening to. And it just really was one I could... Caitlin Tarver, yeah. TARVR, yeah, Parallel Universe. So it was just a song. Sorry, guys, I'm trailing off into memories and thoughts here, as I usually do. I hope you don't mind. But, it was just a song I could really relate to, I guess, because you think about, like in another, universe or another planet or, would things be different, and I think about that movie, Another Earth, too. And if you've never seen it, you should watch it. I have some spoken word that is inspired by Another Earth, the 2011 sci-fi movie. I wasn't particularly happy with some scenes in that movie, but I think the ending was really impactful, and like how, coming across, like, it would be interesting, right? A 2.0 version of yourself, right? I mentioned this on the podcast, or a doppelganger, right? I think we've seen that on the Flash CW series. I'm a comic book sci-fi nerd, guys, so sorry if I'm boring with this, but anyways, I think it's interesting, right? And you can think about it this way, I think a lot of us, we get inspired by, film, television, comic books, right? Things we're exposed to throughout our childhood, especially. And music can inspire us, all kinds of things. So you really have to think about something as a focal point of your short story. And if something's inspired by something, you should always, credit it or state that or share it somewhere, right? So yeah, I personally really love thinking about things from, different perspectives. And, I think that whole concept of, is there another you out there is so interesting, or is there another Earth or another universe, in another parallel universe, right? What would your life be like, or another planet, Would they do the same exact things you're doing now, or do they have a better job? Did they not go through all the same things you did, or did they, succeed? Did they, do this and that? Yeah, you think about, that, I guess, that Parallel Universe song, that Caitlin Tarver, I'm so sorry, I'm tripping up names, was very, very interesting to me, or relatable, because it's something I guess I thought about too at some point in time, and I said this on the podcast, guys. I'm like, if there's a 2.0 version of me out there in the world, or ever in existence, right? I'm just, obviously this is just for fun. I'm just saying, I hope it's not like an evil version of me or something, or like a criminal version of me. That would suck, right? I think, different choices and, that we make, our paths being different, I think that's an interesting take, a 2-point version of ourselves, what would they do versus what we're doing on this planet, right? It's just a very interesting concept to me, I think, I love science fiction, and I don't know if you guys are watching any like sci-fi shows lately or anything like that, but I think you guys have heard like Alien Earth is out or something on, I think, FX or Hulu or something. It looks cool. I haven't seen it yet, but I saw the most recent Alien movie and I thought it was okay, but I'm a fan of like the originals with like Sigourney Weaver, right? And those, the earlier ones. I think you just can't beat some of the originals. They're just like, they just hit you differently, right? The originals, and they think about it, they didn't have a whole lot to work with back then in the days in terms of special effects as much as they do now, and I think the quality was just really, really amazing and stellar. But yeah, so yeah, there are there are things out there saying there's no evidence of like parallel universes or other things like that, but there are totally other other deep places of space that have been unexplored, right? And till today. And I really wonder about that, 30, 40, 50, 60 years from the world, the other, the other number of planets, and things in the universe, right? It's there's a lot of unknowns and mysteries there, right? Obviously we are aware of, Jupiter, Saturn, Neptune, Mars, Mercury, Venus, and the other one, I'm not going to say. say the other word. But, one of the first ever science fair projects I did, guys, I'll share a few. This is also an audio diary series for me and sharing memories too, along with the podcast. And if it sparks you to write something, totally, feel free to share or let me know, or, note that somewhere. I don't know. But, one of the first ever science fair projects I did was on Coca-Cola, guys, like the sugar content of Coca-Cola and examining it. Totally. I remember that. And my dad was there, and my parents, they attended my science fair exhibits and other stuff. And the second one I did, I think it was on the solar system and stuff. And I can't believe this, guys, but I totally tripped up when someone asked me what are the planets. I was like, what? I was just really nervous. Someone had asked me that question previously, and then the second time someone asked me, I just like stumbled, and I was just like really nervous, and I was just missing one planet, and yeah. So anyways, that happens. But any case, I loved partaking in science fairs and those display board ones. I also had one where I was doing a comparison, the breakdown of something as simple as a banana, organic banana versus conventional banana, because they put pesticides right in conventional food. So I did sort of a container analysis on the two side by side and a chart, breakdown. And yeah, that was interesting. That was probably not my favorite one I did, though. I would say I was really into the National History Day assignments, for middle school, the National History Day project. Other schools were, involved in it too. And, the first one I did, I think I shared, was like on the Black Death bubonic plague. And yeah, so I did a lot of research on that. And, I had on my display board like a skull cut out, two eyes others could look through, like a viewing window. And in the back, there was it was either a beak doctor or a crow or something, spooky. So I tried to make it interactive a little bit besides, what was on the display board. And then I also, for my second National History Day project, I did a project on, Dred Scott, right? The Dred Scott decision. And yeah, for that, I took two those postal mailing tubes and made columns and did a decoration, like a printout column around it. And then, did almost like a timeline type, I think I still have a photo of it somewhere, but it's probably one of my favorite projects I ever did, in that realm of like display boards and events and things. I got an honorable mention on that one, and it was absolutely one of my faves. I never forgot that. Over the years, again, I also did, some, just, those flat, giant black display boards. I mentioned this, I think. I would take flashcards, right, the back of flashcards, like the smooth white portion of it, and I would draw comic panels and cartoons on the back of those, and just do like events in history on those, and do it in my cartoon style, right, for fun, and extra credit assignments, essentially, right, for history and things like that. And yeah, it was always fun doing those comic art panels and doing history events on them. I would say I was always a fan of like history and science for sure. Obviously, I think my weakest subject would probably be, chemistry, and I wouldn't say like I'm a math expert or anything like that, and things like that. But obviously we all have our strengths and weaknesses and things we could improve upon. But I always did my best, it always sucked to ever fail at something or to not do well on something or subject, right? So I always gave it 100% effort, no matter what, I think, for sure. But anyways, just sharing, I think, over the years, a lot of those projects I did in school also really inspired me to do more spin-offs, with my work. And I did do actually later on in high school, in middle school, I did a Dred Scott decision project, but then in high school later on, I did also a, perspective, a short story on the events, that Dred Scott underwent, right? And, what it was, perhaps like the case, or with his family and the interactions, and everything, So it was, I had to research like what language, they used back then in those days and things like that, obviously, right? And yeah, it was, I think if you're ever doing like a time travel piece or something like that, you have to really look back at the word choices. Like I used to use some old English even in some of my European short stories and other ones, and some other ones that were a time trip. And same thing with like When the Time Goes, right? And just researching what buildings look like, the names of buildings, the structures, right? And the styles, right? Brick styled or, various cobblestones and stuff like that. So yeah, it's really important to paint out the picture of your short story, or even when you're doing a research paper or anything like that, you want to be as detailed as possible. You always want to, whenever you're doing something of that nature, an essay even, or research paper, right? You want to credit your sources and everything like that. It's so important. And, any inspiration pieces. So yeah. Anyways, I'm just sharing. So I hope you got something out of this episode. Again, what we look for at Dippity Lit Mag, and Dippity Press, right, isn't necessarily what another place is looking for, as I mentioned, right? So keep that in mind. Again, you're going to get countless rejections on your short stories, your work, whether it be a short story or not, a poem or an essay or, anything like that. And it's going to take time to find a home for your work. And it's possible to get acceptance on your first place you submit to, but I think it's very, rare, right? So you just got to keep trying. You got to keep trying. I would say, submitted a bunch of short stories to lit magazine journals myself to date, but I have, a couple times, a year or two ago. But mostly I've been focusing on, I think, poetry too myself. But I feel compelled now, though, guys, to start submitting flash fiction and short stories myself again too, but I'm not sure. I said I was going to take a break from doing that and just focus on the relaunch of Dippity Lit Mag and, some other stuff. And I'm looking for additional, work and products and stuff to do right now and stuff. And, I have issues with my left side a little bit. So, so I think it's, it's fun, to write stories in your downtime and to think about, perspective rights and what ifs. You can do a lot with, fiction, right? And even nonfiction is awesome, writing things based on true events and stuff too. But I really like creating worlds, creating characters and stories. And, flash fiction is really, again, bite-sized impact. That's what you're going for, So, yeah. I think, it's hard for a lot of writers, right, getting that feedback on stories and stuff like that. A lot of places, there are places out there that have free feedback windows again, but there are some that have detailed, paid feedback windows. But don't do anything that's, really costly to you, right? I think you could start with having some close friends read it. Obviously, your friends don't want to say, your close friends or family members, they don't want to say, your work sucks or anything like that, but tell them to be like raw and brutally honest with you. I think that's important. If they're confused about something or they notice grammatical errors, they can help you maybe, fine tune it, maybe get some feedback from them. Again, some places, once I see some writers post they're on their Substack or other blogs and personal places. There are places out there that permit that, right? Or previous published work. So you just have to, look back at that episode, right? When I shared also in the description and the video of, ways to find lit magazine journals. I have a playlist out on YouTube as well, the different databases and search directories. I've seen a lot of writers, enter like, Reedsy. Reedsy has some competitions and search databases too, for directories. I haven't really dived into that a whole bunch, but REEDSY, Reedsy, they have, opportunities listed and some, I think, contests and challenges out there too, in terms of like short stories too. And there are tons of other platforms out there that have, short story contests and challenges, right? But I think a lot of us, again, try to look for fee-free opportunities, right? So make sure you look back a couple episodes at that one where I covered how to find free, submission opportunities. I think it was episode 51. And then, I covered in episode 56, right, submission management systems. And then I also have, earlier audio episodes on, how to find lit mags and journals and places to submit. Like in the first 5 episodes, it's one of them. I think episode 2, right? Or I could be wrong. But yeah, you can dig through some of the past podcast episodes. And sometimes my numbers are off on the episodes because it's hard to remember the exact point unless I have the list up or something, So yeah, I hope this episode helped you. Short story writing is not easy by any means, whether it be fiction or nonfiction at all. It's tough. So yeah, I think, it takes time to really develop your style, of writing, whether it be in the short story realm or poetry, right? Or, yeah. So just know that, you're going to bound to face rejection and declines, but you got to keep trying, and I mentioned, some poets and writers, right, if it's been, quite a long time, right, they've built up rejections, they do end up, publishing a collection of, their declined work, like, of short stories and stuff in an ebook or somewhere, right? The work that they haven't found a home for, perhaps after 5-10 years or something, you don't have to wait that long, but, what happens, sometimes there'll be work you have sitting and sitting and sitting, and you may just want to share that out there somewhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be an ebook. It could be, on a Substack, your personal website, blog, or some space, others could read it or come across it, right? But yeah, I think it's nice to submit to lit magazine journals, right, short stories, and there's some really cool ones that do, print focused short stories, and it's nothing but short stories. I've seen a lot of really cool sci-fi places too, for sure. Just really love the sci-fi short stories and stuff. There was this website, one of my friends used to write on, nothing but, aside from DeviantArt, right? I think it was, what was it called, guys? So DeviantArt, right? I've seen writers post stories and stuff out there. I think it was, oh yes, it was fan fiction. I remember now. So yeah, I think one of my friends used to have a fanfiction.net account, right? And I don't know if you guys are familiar with fanfiction.net, but essentially, right, the name, right? So everything like from movie inspired rights to, like it could be on Marvel characters or, movies, right? Like Tarzan or, Hercules or things like that, right? Disney movies, all kinds of movies and TV shows, right? Inspired rights like that. I had a friend who absolutely loved Treasure Planet, and I really enjoyed reading their, the plot they were building out and everything in the chapters of that. And I think they're doing actually a movie of Treasure Planet, aren't they? I could be wrong, or maybe, I can't remember. In any case, if they are, that's awesome. And I think Treasure Planet was a very unique for sure. I ended up drawing Jim Hawkins and Morph and some of the other characters for sure. So I think, again, even dabbling in, fan fiction, it can help you get your gears turning, things like that. I don't know if there's any lit mags or journals that focus on fan fiction at all, do they? I don't know. Let's do a search here, guys. I'm curious. Fan fiction lit mags. I don't know if that's ever going to populate anything at all. There could be one out there that focuses on fan fiction. I'm trying to, oh, is this one here? So it looks like there are some places when I type there, it says literary fanfic or Commonweal magazine. I don't know if they're still around or, yeah. So I'm sure there are other ones out there, fan fiction magazines, in existence if you do some searching, yeah. So I don't know. I haven't come across a ton myself, but there might be. I think fan fiction's fun though. I grew up reading, back in middle school days and stuff, quite a bit of fan fiction pieces and things like that just for fun. And yeah, one of my friends was really into it. So then I started getting into reading that a lot more too. And, again, we used to like swap and exchange our thoughts on our work, and I really miss that. But, yeah. And, yeah, so you can do a lot, in terms of short stories, right? You have, especially with fiction, right? You can use your imagination and get really creative with it. And, yeah, I think, again, just be careful. Don't hop around a bunch, right? You want to build out a scene and really focus on it and carry it all the way through, right? Make it cohesive, focus on clarity and all of that, right? You want to, again, make sure it's, think about like a puzzle piece, right? You don't want to have it where there's so many missing pieces in the puzzle, right? So many question marks. It's okay, again, to have like a cliffhanger and stuff like that, but you want it to feel, that it's again, a very, a very, very cohesive piece, from top to bottom, that you've submitted. So yeah, I hope this helped you, sharing tips, my experiences, and some flashbacks and memories. Sorry, I was going to science fairs and National History Day again, but I think that doing those projects and things like that, and online writing communities, all of that stuff, some moments in my life, I think that really helped me develop my writing, and things like that, and doing different forms of writing, research papers, and a mix of poetry, flash fiction. I think it helps as a writer. If you've never tried writing a short story and you're listening to this, or a poem even, right? You should try and dabble in other forms and styles of writing just for fun and to challenge yourself. You may enjoy it. You may get an acceptance on one when you try writing a different style of writing or something, And yeah, so again, I shared on this podcast and in some of the earlier episodes that the work I predominantly submitted to Lit Magazine journals myself was based on real actual experiences, right? That got acceptances or inspired by true events, right, behind it. A little bit. And yeah, so that's not necessarily the case for everyone, right? I mean, flash fiction, right, is on fiction experiences. And yeah, so just keep that in mind, again, what one place looks for is not necessarily what another place is. One place may reject your short story 10 times, right, after revising it or something. And then another place may take it like you're, and that happens, right? There are places that, may take it and places that won't, And yeah, I totally have seen, writers in the community, have one short story get multiple acceptances, and be published in more than one place, because they allow previously published work. So yeah, you just got to keep trying, and it's totally possible, to, have one short story that's super strong and it gets accepted in multiple places, as long as they permit that, right? And yeah. So that's pretty much it. Again, I hope this episode helped you. Again, I was talking about memory clips, pies, even food on this episode, a little bit of everything. But yeah, just sharing a little bit inside of, what Dippity Lit Mag looks for when we're, getting short stories, flash fiction. And, some of this applies to some other lit magazine journals, what they're looking for typically, and obviously creativity is a huge part of it, but I didn't cover every single thing, obviously just like some main key points and things to keep in mind. And obviously you have to be mindful again about the level of appropriateness, right? Obviously if it's like there's some children and kids focused, magazines out there and stuff like that. So you want to make sure it's appropriate, right? For the audience, absolutely, you're submitting to, right? What they permit, if it's PG-13, right, nothing rated R, nothing like that, or PG writing, so I always say try to keep it PG-13, but again, if it's like a Halloween themed magazine or lit mag or journal or on the spooky or dark side, and they literally outright say that, then obviously you could go there, right, and, to those rated R scenes or darker things in nature, obviously, yeah, so yeah, and some places say, hey, give us, just put a note or trigger warning or heads up for a team. Some outright say that and some don't. So just be mindful about that, So yeah, that's pretty much it. Be careful about, places again that state, identifying information on the document itself, and things like that, especially for contests and challenges. Places are really strict about that, especially, So just be mindful about that, stay within the word count and the page length limits and, all of that, those not following the guidelines is a really easy way to get declines right off the bat. P.S. guys, it's always a good idea to also, just a reminder, read some of these short stories or pieces that have been accepted by a lit mag or journal in the past, read their online publications, read some of their issues if you can. I think that definitely gives you a sense of what they're looking for as well. And yeah, again, creativity, originality are so important again. So yeah, just wanted to tack that on. And one more thing I would say too, don't make your piece feel unfinished, right? And again, that comes with, feeling like you have to rush, right? I think with just 500 words, for example, if that's the word count, right, limit. Other places may have different, word count limits or, how many words you can have total. But that whole aspect of, it feels like a 500-yard dash, right? But I think still with 500 words, you can remind yourself, you can take others on a journey, a trip, right? A short trip. It could be, not necessarily a long road trip, but it can be a drive, a scenic drive. Think about it that way, a short scenic drive, and you're like adding all the description and layers and packing it. I'm not saying, again, you have to have a bunch of words, detail wise in there, but you have to, again, balance that out between, painting the picture and what's going on in the scene or event of your short story, or, building it out, right? A lot of writers, poets, and, things like that, have said in the community, right? Short stories, right? They should be that whole aspect of, think of it like a power lift, right? You build and build and build, and then it strengthens, right? It's like building muscle, essentially, right? So the more detail you put into it, you can build on muscle or strengthen your you're right, or short story in a sense. Sorry, these analogies perhaps are weird to you guys that I'm making. Like, I went with pies and, but and muscle building and bodybuilding now. I don't know, guys, does it help? But, what I'm saying is, again, with short stories, right, you can only present a small little, again, piece, right? It's very, very condensed. So you really have to think about, that saying, right? I mentioned this on the podcast. Others have heard it. There are various sayings tied to short stories, right? Keep it short and sweet, right? Short and sweet. And the short story doesn't have to be sweet, again, but you know what I'm saying, right? If it's like a horror short story or something like that, it could add, and then a dark turn or something, or a twist. But absolutely love being surprised when I read short stories, and this was very interesting, intriguing, and obviously, with flash fiction pieces, I think it's not necessarily a bad thing. We want to, see a short story go further or something, or do a part 2 of it, or see it go further. That means, we perhaps enjoyed it, but we shouldn't feel like there are gaps or a lot of loopholes, or very lackluster in details, right? Or very empty, right? Or just too abrupt and, straight to the point, right? Like, or he walked, right? Where did he go? Or she danced, what type of dance was she doing? You have to be very descriptive and detailed in terms of be specific, right? Whatever you're doing in your short stories, or, trying to paint out, scene wise, or, development wise, right? It absolutely is a journey. It's a short trip, but you can pack a punch, right, in a short amount of words. So it's just a matter, same thing with poems and other forms of writing, right? It's just a matter of the construction of it, right? So, yeah. So I think, circling back again, one more circle here, we're doing, what helped me, I would start off with the title, when I was writing short stories, and then the beginning part. And I sometimes like to create outlines, right, of, what happens in the short story, no matter how long it is, just outline the events or what I want to put into the short story, right? And just, A, B, C, a series of events. But I think you want to make sure you're not in the habit of just saying this happened, then that, right? Or, they lived happily ever after, right? Nothing as basic as that, right? You don't want to be, again, very short and in terms of abrupt. I mean, you want to keep it short, but you don't want to be it like super, super short, right? And I'm saying you're just like saying statements, right? I was, walking, right? But where were you going, right? We want to know, specific details is what I'm saying. You don't want to have super short sentences that are just, feel rushed or skipping to the end, right? Of like, oh, and then they went all the way here, right? What happened? There's like a huge chunk missing, so you have to make sure that you are building it up and it makes sense. You're not like, doing hopscotch in your short story, because that can confuse the reader, that can make things muddled, right? And very, messy. So, yeah. Again, I think it helps to get feedback from close loved ones, friends even, or, if you're not familiar with short stories or just starting out, maybe partake in writing communities, maybe do some feedback workshop events. There's some I've shared on the podcast that are, not like $70, $80, $90. There's some, fairly reasonable, and you get, fee waiver requests for some workshop and events, to, work on, ironing out your short stories, or have, sessions with some writers, in the world, you don't necessarily have to be located where they are. So yeah, on the podcast, if you dig back a couple episodes and, dig through the series, you'll come across some events and resources, for, strengthening your writing or improving your writing, right? I can't remember which episode that was off the top of my head, but yeah. So yeah, again, I hope this helped you. I know it was, again, almost an hour-long episode, I believe, again. But yeah, not all episodes are this long, but I try to share experiences, memories, and thoughts all collectively, and I hope, it helps someone out there. So, yeah. So take care, guys, and bye, yeah, and grab some pie. You don't have to, or, grab your favorite snack or whatever, and bodybuilding, I don't know. I was thinking about muscle building or strengthening writing. I was trying to do an association there, but, yeah. Anyways, that's it. Take care. I hope you have a great rest of your day when you're listening to this, or night, or, evening. Yeah, whenever.